Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me again this week as we are continuing to look at the epistle of First Peter. We're going to be beginning in chapter 3 today in verse 1. But before we begin to get into the exposition of the passage, I do have a t-shirt, and I'm not sure if I've ever worn this before on the podcast, so forgive me if I've done this before, but this is a shirt I got in Israel a few years back, and if you notice, what it says is Duc in altum, and what that is Latin. It means put out into the deep, and it's referencing, of course, Jesus' instructions to Peter when he had Peter sit in the boat, or had him ask Peter to sit in his boat and preach the gospel to the crowds. And then Jesus said to him, push out into the deep and throw your nets out. And of course, Peter said, Lord, we've been fishing all night. We're professional fishermen. We know what we're doing. You don't. And there's no fish to be caught. And Jesus said, just do what I tell you. And so he tosses his net in and he pulls it up with a large catch of fish. But that whole phrase of you put out into the deep is the idea of trusting God even when he is telling you to go into deep places. Now, the t-shirt is from a location which was the ancient city of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from. And what's significant about that is there's a Catholic hotel and resort area that's built there right on the southwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, just a little bit to the west of the city of Tiberias. And it was there that Jesus, of course, led Mary Magdalene to Christ, casting out 7 demons. It's also where they found, not too many years ago, a few decades ago, they found the remnants of one of the ancient fishing boats from the time of Jesus, which is on display at a kibbutz called Nafgin Sar, just a little bit north of the city of Magdala, or the ruins of Magdala. The city was pretty much lost and forgotten. The Romans destroyed it in 66 AD. It became silted in from Mount Arbel's, really the off-running of the silt from Mount Arbel, which is just above it. And when they began to dig for, or began to excavate to build a hotel, they came across the ruins of the city that had been long forgotten. What was significant about it is they found a synagogue, which is the oldest remnants or remains of a synagogue from in all of Galilee, dating back to literally the time of Jesus. It's very, very likely that this very synagogue that they've excavated was where Jesus came and preached as he made his circuit around the Galilee, visiting various communities and preaching in various synagogues. And so anyway, I thought this is one of my favorite t-shirts because it has the fishing boat on it, and it shows the stones, which are basically, basically they used for making walkways. And of course it has that comment, put out into the deep. And so it's one of my favorite t-shirts, and I thought I would share it with you today because I don't think I've ever mentioned it previously, so forgive me for that. But let's move on to our conversation about 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. And I have to confess, this week we're going to be kind of walking through what I think is kind of a minefield for me, because it talks about the relationships of husbands and wives, and there's been a lot of, I think, misinterpretation, overinterpretation of what the New Testament teaches about the relationships about husbands and wives. And we find that many times people react very negatively to the biblical instructions, and yet that's because they're not being presented in a very balanced, or I would say even a accurate biblical way. But the passage begins in verse 1 by saying the following: Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without the word by the behavior of their wives, and when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Now, what's interesting to me, I had a lady say to me one time, I don't understand why God is so unfair to women. He puts all this pressure on women to submit to men, but he doesn't make the men do anything. And my counter was real simple. No, he didn't ask them to submit to their wives. What he told them is to sacrifice their lives for their sake. And so it's really important, I think, that we begin to realize that there are instructions that are somewhat onerous to both husbands and wives, obligations that God puts on us in terms of our horizontal relationships with those in our life around us, beginning with our most central relationship as a married person, that which exists between a husband and his wife. This is kind of the foundation upon which all civilization and societies rest. And when you see a culture where divorce increases and the breakage of homes, and then, of course, the impact upon the children is devastating. But more importantly, we realize that you're basically ripping out the very foundations upon which a society is built, which is really troubling for the time that we're living in, because we see actually the rate of divorce has stabilized around 45% of marriages end in divorce. That's not as bad as a lot of places, but nonetheless, it's pretty bad. In China, I believe it's about 99%, believe it or not. But the whole thing that's really kind of sad about it is that it really begins to metastasize like a cancer within a society, that children grow up without role models, because somebody once put it very aptly, I think, that there's no such thing as parenting. There's just simply mothers and fathers, and both are necessary to bring stability and security and correct training and guidance into a child's life. Well, we focus so much today upon the dysfunctionality of certain fathers and mothers or families that we overlook this fact that even in a dysfunctional family, kids turn out healthier and happier when their parents stay together. There's something that's taught in that kind of stick-to-itiveness that teaches kids to endure and to be faithful and to not just simply be governed by their emotions and their feelings, but doing that which is right and true and good. And so it's fascinating that we find that Peter and Paul both focus very strongly upon the issues of the dynamics of husbands and wives. And they wrote both of them, I think, from a position of understanding, having both of them been married and had families, although Paul lost his, which is a whole other conversation. But it's fascinating because he begins by saying, in the same way. What does he mean by the in the same way? Well, it's really just one word in the original. It's not a phrase like this, and it means likewise, which is the way the King James and the New King James translate it. They just put this one word, likewise, which is really in a way a more literal or accurate representation. It means equally or in the same way. He says that, and he uses this repeatedly. It's interesting. In verse 1, he says, wives, just as Christ laid his life down for the church, you need to also be willing to lay down your life for your husband, and including, I think, implied your children and others. But in verse 7, he turns around and says, and husbands likewise. So he's not just talking to women having an obligation. He's talking about what I call a reciprocal relationship that husband and wives have to each other, a mutual responsibility. So that what the Bible describes as husbands and wives having equal but different roles. Just because the responsibilities are equal doesn't make them the same. Men are created by God with their unique, distinct qualities, which predispose them to be fathers and not mothers, and women similarly have their predisposition genetically and otherwise, which enables them to be mothers and not to be fathers. And one of the things that's really kind of tragic is when a child grows up without a father or a mother, it leaves an imbalance in their life, and there's really a craving to find a surrogate replacement, which is becoming more difficult as time goes on. So basically, he begins as he comes to the end of chapter 2, talking about, look how Christ laid his life down for the church. And he says, husbands and wives, I want you to view your relationships as a married couple in exactly the same way. That Christianity or marriage is really a ministry that people have to one another. And we've kind of diminished it into simply something we do to fulfill a physical need or want. But in reality, it's a way in which we can serve the Lord. And when we begin to elevate marriage to this service to God, we see it as a sacred dynamic and not just a practical or societal dynamic. It changes, I think, our perspective. Because in verse 8, Paul will go on to say, finally, all of you, be of one mind, having compassion for one another, to love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous. So clearly there's no place for domineering, controlling, basically brutish behavior. or rebellious behavior, but he said we're to see each other with the same view, that we're here to compassionately and tenderheartedly and courteously serve and minister to one another within this covenant relationship, this sacred relationship, which we call marriage. So we're out of time. I'll pick it up tomorrow because I think that for many of you, even those of you who aren't married, this is probably a fairly important topic. Blessings.